Welcome to Kilcoursey, our true crime documentary series on the unsolved murder of Father Niall Molloy. This is not an investigation, but rather a comprehensive presentation of all the available facts surrounding this tragic case. Father Molloy was murdered in 1985 at a lavish wedding party in County Offaly, Ireland. The investigation into his death has been marred by allegations of corruption and cover-up. Our aim is to shed light on what happened to Father Molloy and to help the public understand the impact that this crime has had on his family and the wider community. Within the series, we will follow the developments in the case chronologically, starting from the weekend of Father Molloy's murder and continuing through to the present day. We will take you on an intense and sometimes bizarre journey through nearly 40 years of the family's struggle for justice. We navigate a maze of corruption and cover-up that has plagued the investigation since the beginning. We explore the allegations that those in positions of power in Ireland have actively worked to prevent the truth from being revealed. Father Molloy's murder and the subsequent investigation have had a profound impact on all the people involved. For his family, the pain of losing a loved one has been compounded by the lack of accountability for his death. For the wider community, the case has raised serious questions about the integrity of Ireland's institutions. As we delve deeper into this complex case, we will examine the evidence that has been uncovered, the witnesses who have come forward, and the actions taken by those in power to prevent justice from being served. We hope that this series will not only shed light on the murder of Father Molloy, but also on the wider issues of corruption and cover-up in Ireland's institutions of power. Join us on this journey through nearly 40 years of one family's fight for justice and to help ensure that Father Molloy's legacy is one of truth and accountability. Kilcoursey, the unsolved murder of Father Niall Molloy. On the evening of Sunday, the 7th of July, 1985, three good friends, Richard Flynn, his wife Teresa, and Father Niall Molloy shared drinks together in the master bedroom of the Flynn's home, Kilcoursey House, just outside Clara, County Offaly. Before sunrise the following morning, Father Niall Molloy would lie dead. The culprit made a full admission. However, the Molloy family's 40-year search for truth and justice had only just begun. Father Niall Molloy's murder has captivated Irish imaginations since 1985. But how does this murder remain unsolved, if there was a full admission from the culprit? In this episode, we will explore the relationship between Father Niall and the Flynns, and according to the Flynns, what led to him dying on their bedroom floor. Episode 1. It's a messy old business. Born in Mayo in 1884, William J. Molloy emigrated to America as a young man. He bought and ran a very successful bar and cafe in Brooklyn, New York. When Prohibition came into effect, and as Ireland was on the cusp of gaining independence, William, his wife, and their 4 children would leave America. Upon their return to Ireland in 1922, William opened a successful hardware shop and bakery in Roscommon town with his brother. He purchased Carrow Park for his growing family and in order to pursue his interests in farming and bloodstock. Built in 1810 on the outskirts of Roscommon town, it is a beautiful 12-bedroom Georgian country house previously owned by a member of the Anglo-Irish gentry. Set within a picturesque walled estate, the property included gardens, a courtyard, stables, and a working farm. As well as running successful businesses and a busy farm, William also served as an independent senator in the first Seanad. His fellow senators would include William Butler Yeats, Oliver St. John Gogarty, and Douglas Hyde. William held a position of high standing and respect in Irish society, and his family grew up very comfortably. Despite this, he would instill a strong work ethic in his children. They were all expected to help out around the farm. Niall Joseph Molloy, born on the 14th of April 1933 in Roscommon, was the youngest of William and Susanna Molloy's 8 children. Niall would grow up in Carrow Park. Because Niall was the youngest in the family, his sisters and mother would dote on him. Niall was equally devoted to his family, especially his nieces and nephews. Niall's parents had a love of horses, and when growing up, Niall was surrounded by horses and stables. He displayed a keen interest in show jumping, winning his first championship at the age of 14. Over time, Niall would amass a fine collection of trophies and rosettes from taking part in national competitions and gymkhanas. Niall studied to become a priest, first in Maynooth and then in the prestigious Irish College in Rome. Sadly, his mother Susanna died while he was away studying. Niall was ordained in 1957, and his family, who were extremely proud, all travelled to Rome for his ordination. Senator William Molloy would die in 1965. Before he died, he would gift his children part of their inheritance. His son Niall received over £60,000 worth of shares in Roadstone Cement, which would equate to over 1.5 million today. For the next few years, Father Niall would serve as curate in a number of parishes until 1970, when he became the Army chaplain in Costume Barracks at Lone. He served with the Irish Army and was deployed to Cyprus for 6 months in 1972 with UN peacekeepers. Despite coming from an affluent background, he was, by all accounts, very down-to-earth and humble. At the time of his death, he was curate for Fjorty Castlecoot, about 5 miles from Roscommon town. When he took up this position in 1975, the parish house wasn't fit to live in, so it had to be refurbished. During this time, Father Niall lived quite happily in a caravan beside the church while works to the house were being completed. By all accounts, Father Niall was very dedicated to his parish. He was not only held in high regard as a priest by his parishioners, but considered by many to be a very good friend. In keeping with his love of horses, he would establish a number of pony clubs in Roscommon and Castlecoot. Just before his death, Father Niall had been named Roscommon Man of the Year in recognition of his dedication to his parish and community. He helped to get a new school built in Castlecoot and was in the process of renovating the parish hall to host community events. Horses always played a huge part in Father Niall's life. As well as being an accomplished show jumper, he held the title of Chef d'Equipe for the National Hunt and the Pony Club of Ireland. Father Niall's passion for horses meant he travelled and socialised within a so-called horse, he said. He was also a member of the prestigious hunting club, the Galway Blazers. When a teenager on the pony club circuit, Niall would meet and become good friends with Teresa Brennan and Richard Flynn. Teresa's family ran a successful drapery business in Galway City, while Richard's family ran an equally successful retail business in Lacca, County Galway. When Teresa and Richard married in 1955, they and Niall all continued to get along famously. Richard and Teresa Flynn settled down to married life in Tubber House, a property Richard acquired in 1954. The house, surrounded by 340 acres of land, lay on the borders of County Westmeath and County Offaly. Teresa and Richard would have 4 children: David, Maureen, Zandra and Anita. Father Niall knew the younger Flynns all their lives and was like an uncle to them. While he was chaplain at Costume Barracks in Athlone, instead of staying in his quarters, Father Niall stayed in Tubber House with the Flynns. Regarded as a member of the family, Father Niall would often celebrate Christmas and Easter with the Flynns in Tubber House. He also joined them on their foreign holiday every year. Just like their mother, Teresa's daughters would become involved in show jumping from an early age. As they got older, Father Niall supported Teresa and her daughters as they competed in show jumping competitions all around the country. Richard Flynn, born in 1928, grew up in Turlough, just outside Galway City. His father originated from Tubber, County Offaly. After acquiring Tubber House, Richard engaged in dairy farming on his 340 acres of land. In the late 1970s, his herd of cattle would be decimated by brucellosis. Richard also contracted the disease, which would leave him confined to a wheelchair for a month. His condition also left him suffering from bouts of fatigue and depression. Due to this ill health, Richard could no longer manage the farm, so he had to look for other sources of income. He would become the manager of the Athlone shopping centre. In 1977, he registered a private company called K&R Developments at the company's office and named himself as director. He would go on to open a chain of shops in Athlone, Galway, Sligo, Limerick and Blackrock, County Dublin, called RKF Motor Factors. His only son and eldest child, David, managed the shops and would commute between the various premises in his BMW. Richard and David also opened a car accessory shop in the Athlone shopping centre. 29-year-old David was appointed director of Rich Speed Auto Accessories on the 1st of May 1985, just 2 months before Father Niall's death. Richard also owned a coffee shop in the Athlone shopping centre called Chez Nini, which Teresa ran. She was described as being very social and outgoing, while Richard was considered to be more reserved. Teresa was most anxious that her children marry well. Her son David had married Anne Williams, daughter of Edmund Williams, the chairman of the Irish Trade Board. The Williams family also established the distillery which produced Tullamore Dew whisky. Maureen, the Flynn's oldest daughter, was engaged to Ralph Parks, whose family owned significant business interests and properties in Limerick. Teresa would often go to great lengths to make the right impression. On one occasion, she was hosting potential in-laws for an afternoon lunch. She phoned the lunch order into the Shelburne Hotel in Dublin and had them put the food on the train, where it was summarily collected at Clara Station. In 1976, Richard sold 335 acres of land around Tubber House. He would retain the house itself, along with 5 acres of land, which he gifted to his son David and daughter-in-law Anne. In 1981, the Flynns bought Kilcoursey House from the prestigious Goodbody family for an estimated £500,000. Located about 3/4 of a mile outside Clara, the house was a symbol of status. Considered to be a luxury residence, it was a noticeably affluent property located in the townland of Kilcoursey. At over 150 years old and set back off the road, Kilcoursey House had a lawn-lined driveway right up to the front door. A Regency-style manor house, it boasted 20 rooms, 9 of which were bedrooms. Outside was a courtyard, a separate gatehouse for staff accommodation, a paddock and stables to accommodate horses, as well as 60 acres of land surrounding the house. In the 1980s, Kilcoursey House symbolised the elite in Irish society. It had originally been owned by the Goodbodies. They were a long-established wealthy family who owned other country houses in or around Clara. They had made their money operating flour mills and producing jute for the textile industry. The Goodbodies shared a mutual interest in horses with the Flynns, and the two families were friends for over 15 years. Through the Flynns, Father Niall and the Goodbodies also knew each other well. Father Niall and Teresa had a very close friendship since they were teenagers. They trusted each other implicitly, so much so that they began a jointly owned business venture. They would form a partnership, buying and selling horses. Father Niall had a good eye for spotting potential in horses. He also had the means to finance the deals. Teresa had the land and all the facilities needed in order to operate the business. The horses they bought were registered in Teresa's name with the Show Jumping Association of Ireland. This, however, did not constitute proof of ownership. All the horses were jointly owned. At that time, it was not considered appropriate for a priest to conduct business. Therefore, Teresa would become the public face of the partnership. However, witnesses would attest to all the business decisions being made by Father Niall and Teresa jointly. They engaged the services of a solicitor in Dublin, Liam Lycett, to help with the legal aspects of their business deals. No official partnership contract had been drafted between Father Niall and Teresa, but they had a number of joint bank accounts in Dublin, Roscommon, Moate and Athlone. They would gain a good reputation for developing and training show-jumping horses, and the venture would become quite successful. When the Flynns moved to Kilcoursey House, Father Niall was given the brass bedroom, a bedroom and office adjacent to the master bedroom. This meant he could come and go as he pleased and could tend to the horses he kept stable there. These horses were intended to be investments towards his retirement. Father Niall would split his time between Castlecoot and Clara. When he was not busy in his parish, or if he were too tired to drive back to Castlecoot, he stayed over in Kilcoursey House 2 to 3 times a week and most weekends. Locals in Clara would be familiar with the man who visited Kilcoursey House on a regular basis. He could be seen out casually riding a horse or driving a horse and trap, and would always smile and say hello. They would only know him to say hello to. Father Niall would never wear his priest's collar or uniform when staying in Kilcoursey. It was only after he was killed that most people in Clara realised that he was actually a priest. On Saturday, the 6th of July 1985, Maureen, the eldest daughter of Richard and Teresa Flynn, married Ralph Parks from Limerick. Maureen and Ralph were married in St. Bridget's Church in Clara. The reception was a very lavish affair. It was held in a marquee erected on the grounds of Kilcoursey House. However, Father Niall was not the celebrant. He had to officiate another wedding in his own parish of Castlecoot on the same day. He arrived at Kilcoursey House at around the time the speeches were commencing. A place had been kept for Father Niall at the top table, and he joined in the celebrations with the other wedding guests. Outside caterers from the Bridge House Hotel in Tullamore were brought in to provide and serve the food. The drinks were free-flowing from behind the bar all night. A videographer had been hired to capture the event, which was quite exclusive at that time. Because the Flynns travelled in so-called high-flying circles, some notable guests attended the wedding. The groom's uncle, Michael, was a member of the Fianna Fáil National Executive. Their most prominent guests were senior-ranking Fianna Fáil politician Brian Lenihan Sr. and his wife, Anne. Anne Lenihan and Teresa Flynn went back years. They were friends from college days in UCD. Brian Lenihan Sr. had been a previous Minister for Justice, and he would go on in 1987 to become Taoiseach. To the delight of the other wedding guests, Brian Lenihan Sr. entertained everyone by going behind the bar and pulling himself a pint instead of waiting to be served. He was also seen at one point swinging on a hammock outside the marquee. By all accounts, the wedding was a wonderful event. No expense was spared, and the celebrations were expected to go on over the next 2 days. According to Teresa Flynn's official statement, her daughter Maureen's wedding to Ralph Parks passed off very well. The following day, Sunday the 7th of July 1985, the Flynns hosted an afternoon luncheon in the marquee for about 50 of the remaining guests. Again, outside caterers from the Bridge House were drafted in. Father Niall had of course been invited to stay the night of the wedding. However, he had to say Mass the following morning in Castlecoot. He left Kilcoursey House on the Saturday night at about 10:30 p.m, but he promised he would be back after Sunday Mass in time for lunch. After saying Mass the following day, Father Niall returned to Kilcoursey House for the post-wedding lunch in the Marquee. Because of the festivities the night before, lunch was to be served late, at around 3 p.m. Witness statements have Father Niall arriving at Kilcoursey anywhere between 2 p.m. and 3:30 p.m. that Sunday afternoon. Teresa would state that Father Niall turned up at approximately 3:30 p.m., just after lunch had started. She mentioned that the white wine left over from the wedding the day before had been served to the lunch guests. Teresa remembered that Father Niall had helped clear the plates after lunch and most of the lunch guests had left by 5 p.m. The Goodbodies, good friends of the Flynns and Father Niall, had not been able to attend the wedding. They did attend the lunch in the Marquee, and when leaving Kilcoursey House, they invited Richard, Teresa and Father Niall over for drinks at their home later that evening. Mr. and Mrs. Goodbody wanted to hear all about the festivities that went on the day before. After lunch, those who remained in Kilcoursey House consisted of Father Niall, members of the Flynn family, and some of the wedding party. The Wimbledon's men's final was televised that afternoon. The younger members of the Flynn family would recall watching Boris Becker win his first championship, so they hadn't really noticed when the other lunch guests had left. Very tired and feeling the effects from drinking the night before, they claimed that they just lazed around the house for the afternoon. Statements provided by members of the Flynn family would have Richard, Teresa and Father Niall setting off to pay the Goodbodies a visit at around 7 p.m. According to Douglas Goodbody, Richard, Teresa and Father Niall arrived at his house, which was less than a 10-minute drive away, at about 7:30 p.m. Douglas would later go on to describe them as being in good form. They all seemed relaxed and nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary. During their visit, Teresa and Father Niall had 3 gin and tonics each, while Richard had 3 measures of Powers whiskey. Before they left, they were given a tour around the stables, where Douglas showed them his newly purchased horse. Richard had an elderly aunt, May Quinn, who also lived in Kilcoursey House. Apart from going to daily Mass, May rarely went out. A while after their parents and Father Niall left to visit the Goodbodies, one of the younger Flynns suggested to the remaining guests that they go to Paddy White's pub in nearby Clara. Maureen Parks and David's wife, Anne Flynn, would volunteer to stay behind to keep May company. According to the younger Flynn members, at around 9:35 p.m, David Flynn, his sisters Zandra and Anita, along with Ralph Parks, his sister Marie, and her husband Dennis Hochter, plus Ralph's best man and groomsman, all headed to the pub. However, in contrast to the Flynns, Ralph would later state that the group left Kilcoursey House at around 9 p.m, which would be 35 minutes before the Flynns claimed they left. Additionally, Ralph's brother-in-law, Dennis, later told Gardaí the younger group had already been sitting in White's pub by 9:30 p.m. Meanwhile, according to Douglas Goodbody, Richard, Teresa and Father Niall left his home no later than 9:20 p.m. As the younger group left Kilcoursey House for the pub, David, Zandra and Anita stated that they passed their parents and Father Niall driving home from the Goodbodies in Richard's car. David Flynn's statement would be the only one to mention the conversation that took place between the two groups. David Flynn would state, "At about 9:35 p.m, those of us who were left decided to go down to White's pub for a drink, and most of us set off. On our way to White's, we passed my father's car, which was heading back towards the house. My father was driving with my mother in the front passenger seat and Father Molloy in the back. We exchanged a few words, and everyone was in great form." It is unclear whether the younger group were travelling by car or on foot, but they continued on their way to the pub, while Richard drove himself, Teresa and Father Niall back to Kilcoursey House. When Teresa, Richard and Father Niall returned at about 9:30 p.m, Maureen and Anne left to join the others in Paddy White's. Richard's Aunt May was still up, but went to bed soon after Richard, Teresa and Father Niall got home. The three friends then had a couple of drinks in the sitting room. According to Teresa,
"We returned home. Auntie was in her bedroom and I was tired and I went upstairs on my own. It was suggested that we each have a nightcap and Richard was to get these and bring them up to our bedroom."
Apparently, having a drink in Richard and Teresa's bedroom was common practice between the three friends, so there was nothing unusual or untoward about this. Meanwhile, Maureen and Anne had joined the younger group to continue the wedding celebrations in Paddy White's pub. Ralph bought himself a drink and a round of drinks for each of his guests. Up until the year 2000, pubs in Ireland had stricter opening and closing times, and Sunday closing was usually between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. The owners of White's confirmed to Gardaí that they did observe Sunday's earlier closing hours that night. However, neither the owners nor any of their patrons would be interviewed or asked to make statements. In her testimony at the trial, Maureen would state that she and the younger group finished up their drinks and left the pub at closing time, approximately midnight. However, in his statement, Dennis Hochter contradicts Maureen, telling Gardaí that the group all left the pub much earlier, just after 10 p.m. Depending on the witness, the younger group either stayed in White's pub for just over 30 minutes or for 2.5 hours. On leaving the pub, the younger group all went to David and Anne's house, 6 miles away in Tubber, for coffee and sandwiches. David and Anne had planned to stay at home in Tubber House that night. Ralph's best man and groomsman were due to stay over as their guests. The rest of the group were going to return to Kilcoursey House for the night. Father James Dignan was the parish priest in Clara and knew the Flynn family well. He had married Maureen and Ralph on the Saturday and had previously appointed Richard as minister of the Eucharist in St. Bridget's Church. According to Father Dignan's account, at around 1 a.m. on the 8th of July, he received a phone call from Richard Flynn. Richard told him that he should come immediately to Kilcoursey House and that he should be prepared to anoint someone. Father Dignan would claim he arrived at Kilcoursey House approximately 5 minutes after receiving the phone call. Richard led him upstairs to the master bedroom where a man whom he didn't recognize was lying on his back on the floor. Father Dignan noticed bloodstains on the carpet. He claimed he didn't know if the man was dead or alive, but he went ahead and administered the last rites anyway. Richard then allegedly asked Father Dignan to help him phone his family GP, Dr. O'Sullivan, but there was no answer when they phoned. Richard asked Father Dignan to try to reach another doctor and handed him the phone book. Father Dignan realized he didn't have his reading glasses with him and therefore claimed he couldn't read the phone book. He decided to drive back to the parochial house to retrieve his glasses. Ralph, Maureen, Zandra and Anita would all claim that they left David and Anne's house in Tubber at around 12:50 a.m., arriving back at Kilcoursey House at around 1 a.m. Again, Dennis Hochter's statement would conflict as he stated that he, his wife, and the rest of the group arrived back at Kilcoursey House at approximately 1:30 a.m. When the younger group arrived back, neither Dennis nor his wife Marie were allowed inside the house. They were not told what was going on at the time. Dennis's brother-in-law, Ralph, told them either to go back to David and Anne's house or to go home. Dennis and Marie decided to drive home. Father Dignan would tell Gardaí that he returned to Kilcoursey with his glasses and had pulled in behind the younger Flynns as they returned, also at around 1:30 a.m. He described rushing past them at the door, still trying to contact a doctor as a matter of urgency. Father Dignan continued to try to phone Dr. O'Sullivan but was not getting any answer. He would later testify to trying to phone the doctor in Moat Dr. Hughes, but claimed Dr. Hughes' line was engaged. The local GP in Clara at that time was Dr. John Corby, who also lived about 5 minutes away from Kilcoursey House. He was on call that night and was sleeping by his phone. His father, Dr. Corby Sr., was a good friend of the Flynns and had attended the wedding in Kilcoursey that Saturday. Dr. Corby's phone never rang, and Father Dignan didn't knock on his door in the early hours because he was not the doctor they wanted to contact. Richard met his children just inside the front door and told them that Father Niall was dead upstairs. Sandra became very upset, so Ralph walked with her around the garden before going inside. Maureen was a trained nurse, and she rushed upstairs to find her mother kneeling beside Father Niall, frantically trying to resuscitate him, but to no avail. Maureen checked, but couldn't find a pulse. She closed Father Niall's eyes and covered his face with an orange towel. She then placed one of his arms across his chest. With this, Teresa became hysterical. Maureen struggled to calm her down. Ralph and Anita offered to help restrain Teresa, but Maureen asked them to leave the room. She slapped her mother on the face, and according to Maureen, Teresa then passed out. Anita waited outside in case she would be needed. Ralph went downstairs to phone David, who was by this time in bed in Tubber House. According to David's statement, he went to bed at around 1:10 a.m. and was awoken by Ralph's phone call approximately a half hour later at around 1:40 a.m. Ralph told David that he needed to come to his parents' house urgently. There had been an accident, but he didn't elaborate as to what had happened. David's wife, Anne, would later recall that on receiving Ralph's phone call, she and David rushed to Kilcoursey House. She remembered being on the road for Kilcoursey House by 1:35 a.m. Anne's impression when she and David arrived at the house would be that Father Niall was not long dead. She would state that Teresa was hysterical, Richard was in shock, and a lot of drink was involved. She told Gardaí it was very difficult to make sense of what had happened. Dr. Dan O'Sullivan lived above his GP surgery in Kilbeggan, about 15 minutes by car from Kilcoursey House. He was a close friend of Richard Flynn and was the Flynn's family doctor. Through the Flynn's, Father Niall and Dr. O'Sullivan also knew each other well. Dr. O'Sullivan and Richard Flynn had previously discussed going into the hotel business together, and both he and his wife had been guests at Maureen and Ralph's wedding that weekend. When Dr. O'Sullivan went to bed that Sunday night, he had forgotten to bring the phone from his surgery up to his bedroom, so he didn't hear any attempts to contact him. Despite there being no answer on the phone, Zandra Flynn suggested that Dr. O'Sullivan was most likely at home. When David and Anne arrived at Kilcoursey House, Father Dignan offered to drive Zandra to Kilbeggan to try to raise Dr. O'Sullivan. In his statement to the Gardaí, Dr. O'Sullivan would recall, "At about 2 a.m. I was called upon by Father Dignan and Miss Zandra Flynn and asked to come to Miss Flynn's home at Clara to attend Father Molloy. She said that he was dead." Dr. O'Sullivan got into his car and drove to Kilcoursey House, claiming he arrived just after 2 a.m. When he got there, Zandra showed him upstairs to the master bedroom, where he recognized Father Niall lying on the floor. He observed that Father Niall's body was still quite warm and appeared to be only dead a short time. Having ascertained Father Niall was dead, Dr. O'Sullivan switched his attention to Teresa, who was hysterical on the master bedroom floor. With the help of Maureen and Anita, Teresa was brought into the adjacent brass bedroom where Dr. O'Sullivan focused on treating her. After giving her a sedative, Dr. O'Sullivan felt that Teresa may also be concussed, so he suggested that he should bring her to hospital. David and Maureen helped their mother downstairs and into Dr. O'Sullivan's car. Before leaving for the hospital, Dr. O'Sullivan spoke with Father Dignan and suggested the priest notify the Gardaí. David and Richard would also later state that they had both asked Father Dignan to notify the guards. Sergeant Kevin Ford lived in the house next door to Clara Garda Station. At 3:15 in the morning of the 8th of July, Father Dignan knocked on Sergeant Ford's front door. He informed the sergeant that a man, a priest that he didn't know, was dead in the Flynn's home, Kilcoursey House. He went on to explain that he understood it had been an accident. The dead priest had fallen against a wall and had hit his head. Father Dignan told Sergeant Ford it would be considered a terrible scandal in the parish and asked if there was any way it could be kept quiet. Sergeant Ford explained that the man's death would have to be investigated fully, and then he set off for Kilcoursey House, a 5-minute drive away. Sergeant Ford arrived at Kilcoursey at about 3:30 a.m. and was met at the front door by Dr. O'Sullivan. Once he phoned his superior, Detective Inspector Thomas Monaghan, in Tullamore, Dr. O'Sullivan would escort Sergeant Ford to the master bedroom. On the floor lay the body of a man, face up, just inside the bedroom door. His body was fully dressed, but his blue shirt was sticking out at the back, and there was a leaf stuck under his shirt collar. An orange-coloured towel was covering his face. When Sergeant Ford lifted the towel, he saw that the dead man had blood on his face, his upper lip was burst, and there was a deep cut on his lower left jaw. There was foam coming out of his partially open mouth. Dr. O'Sullivan identified the man to Sergeant Ford as Father Niall Molloy from Castlecoot, County Roscommon. He explained he had been a close family friend of the Flynns and that he had been dead for a couple of hours. Sergeant Ford took a look around the room. He noticed the bedclothes were in disarray and were stained with blood. Despite the state of the bedclothes, there did not seem to have been a struggle in the room. Nothing appeared broken or upended. Sergeant Ford observed blood on the floor near the head of the deceased. He also saw blood on the 2 framed pictures on the wall above the body. On the carpet, there was a separate bloodstain, which he roughly assessed to be about 3 feet long by 8 inches wide. Looking into the ensuite bathroom, Sergeant Ford noted bloodstains around the sink area. When he left the room to go back downstairs, he also noticed blood on a white newel post on the landing. He then posted 2 local Gardaí at the foot of the stairs to secure the scene. David Flynn escorted the sergeant into a room where his father, Richard, was sitting on a couch. Sergeant Ford recalled that Richard was dressed in pajamas and a dressing gown. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and his other arm was stretched across the back of the couch. Richard insisted his son David remain in the room. Calmly, Richard said, "Sit down, Sergeant. Have a cup of coffee." He appeared to Sergeant Ford to be of a very calm, cool, and unconcerned demeanour. The 2 men chatted for a few minutes about the wedding the previous day. Then Richard proceeded to apologise to Sergeant Ford for disturbing him at such a late hour. Indicating Father Niall's body lying upstairs, Richard told Sergeant Ford, "It's a messy old business." With this, Sergeant Ford cautioned Richard and told him that he wasn't obliged to say anything, but Richard waved his hand dismissively and explained that he understood all that. He then told Sergeant Ford, "I am very upset about my wife. I struck her with my left, and I hit him at least twice with my right, and that's all there is to it." Sergeant Ford's superior, Detective Inspector Monaghan, arrived from Tullamore at around 4:25 a.m. He was also shown up to the master bedroom and observed Father Niall's body on the floor. He saw the injuries to Father Niall's face, the position of his body, and the bloodstains around the room. At around 4:45 a.m., Detective Inspector Monaghan went downstairs to interview Richard Flynn. Along with Sergeant Ford, they would be shown into a sitting room to conduct the interview. Richard, again, would go on to apologise for the late hour and for getting everyone out of bed. He then proclaimed, "I am the culprit." On hearing this, Detective Inspector Monaghan also formally cautioned Richard and advised him that he was not obliged to say anything unless he wished to do so, but anything he did say would be taken down in writing and May be given in evidence. Richard replied that he understood all that, but that he had to do it. Detective Inspector Monaghan then asked if Richard had caught the priest and his wife in a compromising position. Richard strenuously denied this, stating, No, nothing like that. Richard went on to explain, at about midnight, both he and Teresa had been in bed. Teresa had already taken a sleeping tablet. Father Niall was sitting on the edge of the bed, and they all had quite an amount of drink taken. They were all chatting about holidays when suddenly a row broke out about who was to get the next drink from downstairs. Richard claimed that when he refused to get them drinks, both Teresa and Father Niall physically attacked him. He claimed he knocked them both unconscious. Then he threw water on them to try to revive them. Richard explained that he knew Father Niall had a heart condition and he was having difficulty breathing, so he said an act of contrition into Father Niall's ear. He then went downstairs to contact Father Dignan and a doctor. When he went back up to the bedroom, Teresa had regained consciousness. She was hysterical, and Father Niall was dead. By the time Sergeant Ford had arrived at Kilcoursey, Teresa had already been driven to Tullamore Hospital and admitted. Neither he nor Detective Inspector Monaghan would have an opportunity to speak to her that night. According to her statement, what Teresa Flynn claimed happened that night would be interspersed with memory lapses. One minute she and Richard were in bed, Father Niall was sitting at the foot of the bed, and they were all having a chat about an upcoming holiday in Normandy. The next thing she remembered was coming to on the bedroom floor. She then looked over towards the bedroom door and saw Father Niall lying motionless. There was no sign of Richard. She stated that she initially thought Father Niall had passed out, so she tried to lift him by the shoulders, telling him he better go to bed. When she tried this, she realized there was no sign of life. When she listened, she couldn't hear a heartbeat. She recalled that all she could hear was an awful, gurgling sound. She remembered going out into the landing and calling Richard's name. Her only other memories after that are being sedated by Dr. O'Sullivan and then being driven to Tullamore Hospital. Meanwhile, it transpired that apart from Richard and Teresa, May was officially the last person to have seen Father Niall alive that night. Additionally, May Quinn's statement conflicts with both accounts Teresa gave the Gardaí. May recalled that they all sat in the drawing room chatting until Richard and Teresa announced that they were going to bed. According to May's statement,
There was no one else in the house. We were in the drawing room. They were talking while I played patience. Teresa and Richard were tired and said that they were going to bed.
explaining that she went to get a drink from the kitchen as she normally did before going to bed, May met Father Niall on his way in to get a drink. Father Niall got a glass of milk and then he went upstairs. May claimed that this last sighting of Father Niall was at about midnight. But how could May Quinn have met Father Niall at midnight if, according to Teresa, she had already retired to bed at around 9:30 p.m.? May claims she went up to bed a few minutes after Father Niall. Normally, her bedroom was across the hall from Richard and Teresa's. On the weekend of the wedding, she was sleeping in a spare bedroom at the end of the corridor, presumably because of other wedding guests being invited to stay over. She recalled closing the door of the spare room and claimed she heard nothing else at all. May didn't hear any row or drunken adults attacking each other. She didn't hear Teresa frantically trying to resuscitate Father Niall or call out for Richard. She also didn't hear Teresa being hysterical or the commotion of people who tried to help calm Teresa down. May apparently slept through the arrival of the priest, the doctor, and the Gardaí who would eventually be stationed at the foot of the stairs to secure the scene. In fact, Father Dignan, Dr. O'Sullivan, Sergeant Ford, and Detective Inspector Monaghan had not been made aware that she was upstairs in the house. According to May's statement, her grandnephew David told her the next morning that Father Niall was dead. At approximately 2:40 a.m., Dr. O'Sullivan drove Teresa, Maureen and Anita to Tullamore Hospital. approximately 20 minutes away. Teresa claimed she recalled being hysterical while on the drive to the hospital. She kept slipping in and out of consciousness. Dr. O'Sullivan would later explain that because he and his wife attended the wedding the day before, he felt very tired while trying to drive. He remembered being blinded by the headlights of oncoming cars, telling the Gardaí he drove very cautiously, arriving at the hospital just after 3 a.m. Dr. Peter Greeley had been the doctor on duty in the casualty department of Tullamore Hospital that night. A year later, at Father Niall's inquest, Dr. Greeley provided a deposition. In his deposition, which he would read aloud, Dr. Greeley had noted that on arrival, Teresa was confused, disorientated, and displayed an hysterical element with no understanding of why she was in hospital. He confirmed that he had referred Teresa to the surgical consultant on duty that night, Mr. Durkin. Dr. Greeley would state that Mr. Durkin admitted Teresa between 3:15 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on the 8th of July, 1985. Dr. Greeley wrote in his notes at the time of her admission, brought in by Dr. O'Sullivan, 3:15 a.m. Story from GP. Beaten up by husband at home earlier this a.m. Husband involved in murder of priest at same time. Bizarre story ratified by checking again with GP at 4 a.m. A blood sample would be taken from Teresa on admission, and it found her blood alcohol level was 220 milligrams of alcohol per 100 millilitres of blood. No traces of the sleeping tablet she had taken or the sedative she had been given were found in her system. While in hospital, she noticed her left arm had been badly bruised and she had sustained an injury to her jaw. Anita stayed with Teresa after she was admitted to a private room in ICU while Dr. O'Sullivan drove Maureen back to Kilcoursey House. Dr. O'Sullivan's claim of presenting Teresa for admission just after 3 a.m. would be in accordance with Dr. Greeley's notes, yet Dr. O'Sullivan still managed to be back in Kilcoursey House by 3:30 a.m. where he would escort Sergeant Ford to the master bedroom to show him Father Niall's body. In his brief statement, Dr. O'Sullivan only mentioned that he admitted Teresa to the hospital in his own car. He was not asked to elaborate on his statement or to provide any other details of Teresa's admission to the Gardaí. The Sheridan family were the nearest neighbours to Kilcoursey House. Their 15-year-old daughter claimed to have seen Father Niall that Sunday evening between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. She watched as Father Niall brought a horse and trap out for a run on the main Clara to Kilbeggan Road. She then saw him travelling back towards Kilcoursey House. If this is true, apart from anyone in the Flynn family, this girl could have been the last person to have seen Father Niall alive. Her statement was not taken by Gardaí until 2011. Her alleged sighting of him between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. would conflict with both the Flynns and Douglas Goodbody's recollections of events that evening. In his official statement to Gardaí, Douglas Goodbody claimed that Richard, Teresa and Father Niall arrived at around 7:30 p.m. and were still visiting with him and his wife until 9:20 p.m. Another independent witness claimed to have seen a very peculiar event that Sunday evening. A local butcher from Clara had been visiting his sick father in hospital in Dublin. Between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. he was driving back towards Clara. As he approached Kilcoursey House, he saw what he described as a respectably dressed middle-aged man jump over the wall to his left, the same side of the road as Kilcoursey House. This man then ran along the road, heading in the direction of Clara, and after about 20 yards, he jumped back over the wall again. The butcher was able to provide a description of what the man looked like and what he was wearing. He described the man as having greying hair. He was wearing grey trousers and a bluey-coloured shirt. This witness did not come forward with this information at the time. The Gardaí, during their investigation, for whatever reason, did not conduct house-to-house inquiries or the canvassing of witnesses in the area either. If, back in 1985, had the Gardaí canvassed locals or put out an appeal for anyone with information to come forward, perhaps the butcher may have felt this sighting was important enough to volunteer a statement. He did not make a formal statement until 2011, which he regretted. However, his recollection was still very clear, despite the passage of so much time. At around 3 a.m., an employee of the Flynns, James Lowry, who worked and lived in Kilcoursey House, arrived home. He had been out with friends at a disco at the Bridge House in Tullamore. James worked for the Flynns for over 10 years. He initially tended to cattle when the Flynns owned Tupper House and moved with them when they bought Kilcoursey House. Not long before the move to Kilcoursey, Richard contracted brucellosis, which had left him confined to a wheelchair for a month. Brucellosis can be contracted from livestock, and its symptoms include physical weakness, so the remaining cattle were phased out, and James would be tasked with looking after the horses. James had been dropped off by a friend to Kilcoursey House in the early hours of that Monday morning. He recognised the 2 Toyotas parked outside as belonging to Richard and Teresa. He also recognised Ralph's Porsche and Father Dignan's car, but didn't see Father Niall's car. When he went inside, unusually all the lights were on. On reaching the kitchen, he found Zandra crying, and she managed to tell him that Father Niall had died. James knew him very well. Father Niall came over to Kilcoursey House at least twice a week. At the wedding on Saturday night, he had even been chatting with Father Niall about horses. James had spent most of Sunday at a football match in Tullamore. He did not attend the Sunday lunch. He returned to Kilcoursey House to feed the horses with the intention of going back out later to meet his friends in Tullamore. When he arrived to feed the horses at around 7 p.m, he met Father Niall in the kitchen. The only other person he met at this stage in the house was Teresa. James then left Kilcoursey House to call to see a neighbour. He returned at 9 p.m. to change clothes for his night out. James claimed he met Teresa again in the downstairs hallway at 9:20 p.m, where she told him she was going to make herself a cup of tea. According to James, he left Kilcoursey House at 9:30 p.m. for his night out in Tullamore with his friends. He later told Gardaí that nothing struck him as unusual. When James got back to Kilcoursey in the early hours of the morning, Father Niall was dead. James stood in shock, drinking coffee in the kitchen. The whole situation was later described to him by both Ralph and Father Dignan as a terrible accident. He claimed that that's all he would be told about that night's events. Kilcoursey was also James's home, so he left that morning to stay with the Sheridans next door for the next couple of weeks. When he arrived at the Sheridans that morning, he was visibly upset. Mrs. Sheridan, in a statement she would give nearly 30 years later, recalled James had been crying. While staying with them, James got into conversation with their 15-year-old daughter. This was the same girl who could have been the last person outside of the Flynn family to have seen Father Niall alive. From their conversations, she got the impression that there had been more people in Kilcoursey House at the time of Father Niall's death than was stated, and James knew more than he was letting on. Detective Inspector Monaghan concluded his interview with Richard at 5:05 a.m. that Monday morning. Everything Richard had said was taken down in notes by Detective Inspector Monaghan. The notes were read back to Richard, who said that they were correct. Richard was invited to sign the notes, but he refused to sign them, saying that he would be making a full statement later that day. Richard then requested a copy of the notes, which were subsequently photocopied and given to him via his solicitor. At 5:30 a.m., Detective Noel Lina accompanied Richard into a spare bedroom in Kilcoursey House. The clothes Richard had been wearing when he assaulted Father Niall needed to be confiscated. The guard noticed bruises on Richard's hand and asked, "Was that from hitting the priest?" Richard replied, "Yes, I hit him under the chin. I know I did," while making an upward striking motion. Detective Lina also noticed there were 2 small, fresh, clean scratches on the edge of Richard's left hand. but Richard didn't mention them. Richard then proceeded to undress and handed over his pajamas, dressing gown, shoes and socks. Later that morning, at around 8 a.m., Ralph, in conversation with Detective Lina, clarified that the nightclothes confiscated were not in fact the clothes Richard had been wearing at the time of the assault. Ralph proceeded to show Detective Lina upstairs, where a pair of men's pajamas were found lying crumpled on the floor. When asked, Richard confirmed that the pajamas found upstairs had been the pair he was wearing at the time of the assault. Detective Lina also took this second set of nightclothes into evidence. Detective Inspector Monaghan reinforced the order for the scene to be sealed off. As well as the Gardaí who were on duty at the foot of the stairs, another Garda was posted in the hallway downstairs. More Gardaí were posted at the main gates to the property. Throughout the morning, numerous local Gardaí came and went, relieving their colleagues who were on duty securing the scene. They would have to await the arrival of the investigators from the Garda Technical Bureau and the state pathologist who were on their way from Dublin. But before any of them would arrive, the Flynn family's solicitor, Liam Lycett, pulled up in his car outside Kilcoursey House. David Flynn claimed he called Mr. Lycett after the Gardaí arrived. It would have taken Liam Lycett around 2 hours to drive down from Dublin. It was now 7:30 a.m. From here on in, Richard Flynn stopped cooperating with Gardaí and would only speak in the presence of his solicitor, if at all. Under Irish law at the time, unless a firearm had been used to kill Father Niall, the Gardaí had no power to detain and question Richard. On the 15th of July, a week after Father Niall was killed, Liam Lycett arrived at Tullamore Garda Station. He presented Detective Inspector Monaghan with prepared written statements, all signed and witnessed by him and dated the day before, Sunday, July 14th, 1985. The statements were provided by 8 members of the Flynn family: Richard, Teresa, their son David, his wife Anne, their 3 daughters, Anita, Zandra, Maureen, and Maureen's new husband, Ralph Parks. Aunt May's statement, also prepared and witnessed by Liam Lycett, was not presented to the Gardaí until August 13th, 1985, over a month after Father Niall was killed. Even with the benefit of their solicitors' coordination, the statements from the Flynns would prove vague, especially when it came to the timeline of certain events that Sunday night. From after lunch up until Sergeant Ford's arrival at 3:30 a.m., slight variations, conflicts, and even contradictions between statements became apparent. Richard did not give any indication of what took place in the house before midnight. Teresa gave Gardaí very little to go on when trying to piece together a timeline. The Gardaí could not compel the Flynns to clarify or expand on their statements, and any request to do so were declined by them. Gardaí also interviewed and took statements from witnesses unrelated to the Flynn family who were known to have been in Kilcoursey House that night. Some of their statements also lacked detail, but they would not be approached by investigating Gardaí to clarify or expand on their statements either. Perhaps this is because the Gardaí believed they already had their man. In any murder case, no inconsistency should be too small or insignificant to be investigated, even if you have an admission from the culprit. Father Niall Molloy was 52 years old at the time of his violent death. Father Niall Molloy lies dead on the floor of the Flynn's master bedroom, allegedly killed during a drunken row over who was to get the next drink. The Flynn's versions of what happened leave a lot of questions unanswered. The self-professed culprit makes a full admission, and it seems the Gardaí have their man. In Episode 2, the Garda Technical Bureau and state pathologist arrive on the scene. Strange goings-on come to light in the aftermath of Father Niall's death, and the Molloy family begin to discover The Flynns are not quite what they seem. This series was written, produced and edited by Liv Kerwin. Narration by Marcus Kerwin. Music: Take Up Your Cross by Onichenko Music. We would like to extend our very special thanks to Mr. Bill Maher and Father Niall's family. This series is dedicated to the memory of Joe, Matthew and Tony. This has been a Kilcoursey production.